And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's program. Edward Gordon is an internationally known historian, speaker, researcher, and author. He taught history at DePaul University, Chicago, and has presented hundreds of historical programs across America to professional groups, universities, alumni organizations, community groups, trade associations, historical societies, and of course, museums. Ed Gordon is also the president and founder of Imperial Consulting Corporation. He's the author of 21 books and over 150 articles in the areas of history, business, and education. His latest book is the one he'll be speaking about today, Divided on D-Day, How Conflicts and Rivalries Jeopardized the Allied Victory at Normandy, and is co-authored with David Ramsay. Ed Gordon has appeared on the CBS Network's The Early Show, CNN, the PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and many other media venues. Dr. Gordon earned his BA and MA degrees in history at DePaul University, Chicago, his PhD at Loyola University, Chicago, and pursued postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. Please welcome Dr. Edward Gordon.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here in Seattle at the Museum of Flight. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon a great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and dreams of liberty-loving people march with you. These inspired words by General Dwight D. Eisenhower was the announcement to the world and to the over 1 million men and women who would participate in Operation Overlord that began this campaign. We are here to mark that day in history when the Allied armies joined in battle to reclaim Europe for liberty. We dedicate this program to the memory of the hundreds of thousands of men and women who died to liberate Western Europe in 1944 and in 1945. Our program today will cover the story of the preparation, D-Day itself, the follow-up 3-month campaign, and then a brief analysis of the leadership abilities of these principal leaders that we'll talk about. Well, this is a picture of Sir General Frederick E. Morgan. He began the initial planning for Normandy of the invasion in August of 1943 with a joint staff of British and American officers. Here's the original plan. Because of the limitations of enough ships and troops, they only planned a 3-beach invasion front. And he was told to report to Churchill by the middle of August of 1943 regarding the invasion plan itself, because then they were going to present this to the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the combined American and British armed forces. The old name for this invasion was Roundup, and they needed a new code name. So he sent one of his deputies to the ISSB, which was the International Service Security Board. They were in charge of all the code names issued for all of these campaigns in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. And they needed a code name so they didn't get confused. So he went, and they only had one name available: Mothball. Well, he didn't think that was going to work too well, because he said, you know, when I tell Churchill that this is going to be Operation Mothball, I don't think he will be too pleased with me. So Morgan presented the plan and told Churchill it would be Mothball. Churchill went right through the roof. Do you mean to tell me that those bloody fools want our grandchildren, 50 years from now, to tell the world that the operation that liberated Europe was called Operation Mothball? If they can't come up with a better code word for our landing than that, I damn well will pick the code word myself. So Morgan said. Churchill sat back with his cigar for a moment, and he shouted, "Overlord! We will call this Operation Overlord." And after having studied this operation and campaign for many years, I must tell you that it is our opinion that this probably was Churchill's greatest contribution to Operation Overlord for the entire war. Well, now, all right, here are the Overlord commanders. These are the men we're going to be talking about. Let's go from left to right. First, we have General Omar Bradley, who would command the U.S. First Army. Next to him is Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who was in the command of the 7,000-ship amphibious fleet, and at the same time, he wrote Operation Neptune, which was the amphibious assault. Next to him is Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, who was the deputy commander. He had been the commander of all the air power in the Mediterranean theater. General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander. Sir Bertram Ramsay, who was the commander of the combined British-Canadian Second Army, and he was made temporary ground commander by Eisenhower of the 21st Army Group, which was all the troops at Normandy. And then Chief Air Marshal Tafford Lee Mallory, the Allied Air Commander. General Walter Beadle Smith, who is Eisenhower's Chief of Staff. Now, at the bottom you'll see is George Patton. Lieutenant General George S. Patton. And he, of course, was the commander of the U.S. Third Army, but he was not in command of all the U.S. troops. We'll go into that in a little bit. Now, here is the overall operational plan. I want you to note that it increased to 5 invasion beaches rather than 3. Once this was unveiled, both Eisenhower and Montgomery said that it was too narrow an invasion front with only 3 beaches. But again, the problem was having the necessary landing craft to mount that size of an invasion, let alone also all of the support vessels. Ramsay was the author of the Neptune Invasion Plan, the amphibious assault. Before that, he had helped design Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa, and Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Now, many of you will say, well, I never heard of this man. This is David Ramsay, my co-author. This is his father. He died in a plane accident in January of 1945 on his way to visit Montgomery. He wasn't shot down, it was an accident. So he never issued his own autobiography. His papers are available at Cambridge. A major biography will be coming out on Admiral Ramsay next year. This is the actual operational plan, which was very detailed. I'm pleased to tell you that only 1 ship out of 7,000 ships were lost on D-Day, and that hit a mine right off of Omaha Beach. So this plan turned out to be one of the most successful amphibious assault plans of the war. What were the major points? First, that in order to invade Germany, they had to have a port, particularly Antwerp. In fact, we have 2 people in the back here today from Belgium. Antwerp today is a major seaport, a major entrance of imports into Europe, and it was then. But without that seaport, the Allies simply would not have the logistics to mount an invasion of Germany. Secondly, there was a shortage of the Higgins boats. The Higgins boats are the landing craft, and they were needed all over, both in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and in Europe. Remember, we were involved in Italy then, and of course, all the invasions in the Pacific. Those boats were designed and built first in New Orleans, and then they were built all over the Midwest, up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, floated down, and then taken to Europe. Well, because of this shortage, the invasion was due in May, but because of that shortage, it was postponed to June 6th. And then, of course, the Americans wanted another invasion in the south of France at the same time. That was further delayed to August the 15th. Again, the problem was we simply did not have the lift capacity to mount that size of an invasion. Well, now, here is the good Führer, the supreme war leader, planning his next moves. And in 1942, they started the preparations to defend Western Europe. Before that, the Germans didn't think they had a problem. They didn't have to worry about an invasion. Remember, once they had conquered France in 1940, the French thought the war was over. And so did many British, except Winston Churchill, of course. So the war had continued. They started to mount raids along the entire Atlantic coast. The underground was organized, though the underground was organized by both the communists, the de Gaullists, the French, the British. We had many competing forces all trying to sabotage Hitler at once, which caused some confusion. But by 1943, this man, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the great generals of the German General Staff, he helped to conquer Poland and France. He invaded southern Russia. He was then axed by Hitler because he retreated, and of course Hitler didn't like retreats. He was brought back from retirement and placed in supreme command of all the German armed forces in Western Europe, technically. But the naval forces and air forces were not under his command, neither were all the administrative troops, Gestapo, SS, none of them did he have direct control over. He believed that the way to defeat the invasion when it came was to have a central reserve and then use that Panzer Reserve to smash the Allied invasion. Well, after the defeat in North Africa, this man, the Desert Fox, came to Europe. And he had seen what Allied air power did to his army in North Africa. And he believed that instead of counterattacking from the interior, it would be far better that the Germans actually had troops right along the shoreline, where they would stop the invasion cold at the beaches. Because he saw that to bring reinforcements in, the Allies would interdict them and destroy them. And the underground would blow up the rail tracks and bridges. Well, here are the German dispositions on D-Day. Now, Rommel wanted to distribute the panzers in packets. When they had the invasion of Sicily, there were panzers on the beaches, and even Tiger tanks are no match for a destroyer or cruiser's guns, and they were blown up. What he intended was the panzers would be behind the beaches, and when the Allied soldiers, British or American or French, landed, once they had landed and they were on the beach, the panzers would appear and mix in with them and destroy them. That way, of course, the Allies couldn't fire right on their own troops on the beach. That was part of his solution to the invasion. The Atlantic Wall had planned 15,000 permanent strong points from the north of Holland all the way down to the Spanish border. For 2 years, 250,000 men, 90% of them slave labor, used 1 million tons of steel and poured more than 20 million yards of concrete. Rommel wasn't satisfied. He put in 500,000 anti-invasion obstacles. Some of them were steel spiderweb traps, anti-tank barriers, hedgehogs that would rip the bottoms out of landing craft, and he planted 4 million mines. His idea was the Allies would land at high tide so they'd have a shorter beach to get across in the face of machine gun and artillery fire. Well, the Allies fooled them. They came in at low tide, didn't they? 60 German divisions were in Eastern Europe, 7 panzer divisions, 1,600 tanks. June 6th, 1944, the 1,451st day of the German occupation of France. The curtain rose on history's largest amphibious assault about 1 a.m. as 1 British and 2 American paratroop divisions landed. They plunged out of the air or landed by glider starting after midnight. What were their objectives? Well, let's take a look at it. For the Americans, their objectives here were to seal the beach, the crossway. All this area behind Omaha and Utah Beach was flooded, and there were roads that led into the beaches. Their job was to seize those crossroads so that the Germans could not bring reinforcements in. For the British, the objective they had was this city of Caen. It's not called Caen, that's in southern France. It's called Caen. Why is this so important? Because you see, this whole area is filled with woodland, the bocage, as the French called it, or hedgerows as we called it. But south of Caen is the Falaise Plain. The Allies had tens of thousands of Sherman tanks. They had total air superiority. The plan that Montgomery wrote and presented in May of 1944 to the King of England, Churchill, Eisenhower, and all was that they would take Caen on the very first day, and they then would deploy south to the Falaise Plain. The Americans would land, pivot on Caen. They would not fight here in the hedgerows. In fact, instead they would flank the whole German defenses. This would all be useless, and the Germans would have to retreat, because this is not a place to fight a war, as we will see in a moment. So the British had to seize the bridges over the rivers here so that the armored units landing on Sword Beach would reach and take Caen on the first day. That was by far the single most important objective of the plan. So let's take a look and see what happened. Well, there's the paratroop, and here's the plan. Oops, we're going to go back. So here is Utah Beach. Well, Utah Beach was one of the big success stories because it shouldn't have happened. You see, the boats that were guiding the landing craft, the British guide craft, there was a very strong tide, and they directed them to the wrong location. Two of the boats had been sunk by the German fire, but the one they landed, and they discovered this. General Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, discovered it, and they landed in a gap in the German defenses. There was nothing there, or very little. In fact, where they were supposed to land would have been something on the kin of like Omaha Beach. It was heavily fortified with tremendous amounts of mortar, machine guns, and artillery. So where they landed, which was by mistake, and how many of you have seen the movie The Longest Day, and you've seen the epic words, the war starts here, they went inland. This was the only beach that basically achieved what would be most of the objectives for D-Day. They got all the way, as you see on our map here. This was the objective, by the way, for D-Day, but they did get far inland. They were the only beach that did that. Now let's turn to Omaha Beach. Now, this presented the greatest physical barriers and the greatest German defenses of all 5 beaches. So why in the world did these idiots land there? Didn't they see this? Did they want 5,000 men to be killed on Omaha Beach? Didn't they have any sense? Well, take a look at it. Here's this is the middle beach. The idea was this: if they didn't land in Omaha, the British would be here with 3 beaches, the American beach would be over here, the Germans would concentrate first on one beach and then on the others and destroy it. They wanted instead a 50-mile wide invasion front. So that's why we landed on Omaha Beach. So now here's a picture of the landings itself. Omaha Beach is on or Utah Beach. Let's get back to where we should be here. All right, here's Omaha. Omaha, how many of you have been to Omaha Beach? All right. How many have been to the American Cemetery All right, when you stand in that cemetery and you look down that cliff, that's what all of Omaha Beach was like. There are other parts you can go to today that have sort of been lowered and there are houses on them. And you don't get the idea of how strong those defenses really were. You have a bluff 100 to 150 feet high. The German defenses had 35 pillboxes, 60 light and 35 small artillery pieces, 35 anti-tank guns, 85 machine guns, 60 mortar pits, 38 rocket pits, my God, and 4 artillery positions, and it was booby-trapped from stem to stern. To defend it was a 716th Coastal Division manned by the so-called volunteers that were Slavs and Poles. Basically, they had a choice: be slave labor and die, or you can join the glorious German army for most of them. Rommel, however, had moved the 352nd Infantry Division that had been on the Russian front, decimated and rebuilt, from St. Lo to the coast. And he wanted to put that entire division right behind the coast. Well, the general, Kraus, didn't agree. He only put 1 artillery battalion and 2 infantry battalions on Omaha Beach. The rest he kept as a big reserve 12 miles inland. Now, the Allies didn't know about the 352nd Division. Why? Because the underground, the French underground, the way they would communicate was they would send carrier pigeons with information that French and Allied agents had to England. And the Germans, one of the big pastimes of the occupation troops was to shoot down the pigeons all along the entire coast of Northern Europe. And guess what? They shot down all the pigeons that had the information on the 352nd, so they didn't know it was there. So when the Allies landed, it was very strong. But Rommel, as I said, wanted to place that entire division. Kraus did not obey him, and as you'll see, it's a good thing he didn't. So when the Germans opened fire with their 85 machine guns, they could concentrate on each landing craft as that ramp dropped. And in many cases, all 30 men inside were shot. The forward elements of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were endlessly raked, and Rommel had achieved what he envisioned, the collapse of the Allied invasion at the waterline. Most of the amphibious tanks, and we had these tanks that would land with the troops, and they would take out the pillboxes. Well, what happened? Did they fail? No. Ramsay suggested that those tanks be launched only 3 miles out from the shore. Well, Admiral Kirk, who was the American admiral in charge of the American invasion, he launched them 12 miles from the shore. What happened to those tanks? It was a very rough sea. They only had a canvas skin around them. What do you think happened? They sank, and most of the men died. Only 2 tanks made it to the shore. Now, on Utah Beach, it was different, but on Omaha Beach, only 2. A decisive factor then was the Allied destroyer captains. The Allied destroyer captains saw what was going on, the slaughter, and they came in very, very close to the beaches. Now, destroyers have a much shallower draft. And using signals, they coordinated with the guys struggling on the beach, and they teamed up and they took out those bunkers with hand signals from the shore. The Navy really did a great job that day. And it started out as, again, this is an ad hoc thing. It was not planned that way. Now, observing this was Kirk, and there's Bradley, and they very seriously considered withdrawing the troops from the beaches and landing them in Utah Beach or other beaches. But in the end, it was the heroism of individuals and teams of soldiers that enabled them to gradually work their way to the top of the bluff. And by 11 a.m., they achieved the first breakthrough off the beach. By the end of the day, 3,000 of the 5,000 D-Day casualties occurred on Omaha Beach. So it had been a very, very close thing. Bradley said afterwards, "The Navy saved our hides." And that's a real big understatement. Well, now let's take a look at the British beaches. Gold, Juno, and Sword. The sea was very high. The British troops of the 50th Infantry Division pushed ashore. They met very limited resistance, mainly from Russian volunteers. There was one strong point that they took by mid-afternoon, and by midday they were in, they had gone inland 5 miles. Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Division was eager. Dieppe, how many of you know what happened at Dieppe? Yes, the Canadians in 1942 were landed there as a test, and they were slaughtered. This was their revenge for Dieppe. 400 Germans defended against 2,400 Canadians in the first waves. They put up a stiff resistance. It took them 3 hours to take the town of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. Once the thin line of German defense was broken, however, the Canadians had a relatively easy time marching inland. And now for the all-important Sword Beach. The 3rd Division had 2 major objectives that day. First was to seize the bridges and relieve the paratroopers who had landed earlier, and they had been successful. They had taken those crossway bridges. And the second, obviously, was to support an armored thrust that would take the city of Caen on the first day. Unfortunately, the infantry was ready, but our armored brigade failed to get off the beach due to congestion. And the infantry was supposed to ride on the armor to the jump-off point outside of Caen. Well, it delayed the advance to Caen to much too later in the day, and it helped the Germans to organize their counterattack. Well, what were the Germans doing during this time? And we'll specifically, for our talk today, concentrate on Caen. Well, the commander of the German 7th Army was General Mack. And yes, he did have a birthday party on June the 6th, was his birthday. And he was in command of those troops. And he also was in command of the 21st Panzer Division that had been moved into Caen shortly before the invasion. Montgomery knew about this. He did not tell any of the British commanders who were attacking that day that the 21st Panzer Division existed and would probably counterattack. None of them knew it. He didn't want to burden their morale. So however, the confusion with the German forces was such that Hitler did not allow an attack by that Panzer Division until 7 o'clock at night, though those men were ready to attack and standing by their tanks at 6 o'clock in the morning. Also, the 19th Panzer Regiment, Grenadier Regiment, attacked with them. And their target, obviously, were the British beaches. Marx told the Colonel Haussmann of that group, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." The colonel saluted and said, "I will attack now." Victory or defeat rode with only 98 panzers attacked. Well, let's take a look at it. Here is where Marx told them to attack, between these 2 beaches, to drive a wedge between these 2 beaches. Now, the British advanced here, and they ran right in to the German panzers and retreated. The Germans actually got to the coast and linked up with the troops defending the shoreline. That did not occur till 8 o'clock at night. And another 100 panzers were being organized to reinforce them. When they arrived, all of a sudden, 250 gliders and troop transports for paratroops emerged out of the sky, and they were to reinforce over here the British paratroopers. The Germans didn't know that. They thought they were going to land on them. The Germans panicked. They retreated. They retreated. If the Germans had stayed here and driven this wedge, the battle would have been far more difficult, or might have ended in a failure, because the Germans were ready to reinforce it. So it was very critical that in the end, the Germans, they also made a big mistake, didn't they? So let's look at the results from D-Day itself. Well, they were successful. They had actually breached the Atlantic Wall. The Neptune and Salt plan had largely went off. Ramsay summed it up in his diary. On the whole, we have very much to thank God for this day. Allied casualties, 25,000 casualties had been predicted. Instead, we had 12,000 casualties, 5,000 dead. The paratroopers, Lee Mallory, had predicted that half of them would die. Not true. Did not happen. Now, at the same time, you had 156,000 British, American, and Canadians now inland, but no more than 10 miles. Omaha Beach, here it is. Look, that's all they got. They were hanging on by their fingernails. Caen was not taken, and Montgomery's plan turned on capturing that city the first day. Later, though, on the 10th, he told Bradley how everything had gone according to his original plan. Well, Bradley smiled, and he said to him, well, someday I'll tell Eisenhower how close it really was. So this gave birth to the big lie. And the big lie was this. Now, due to the failure of taking Caen, the British rewrote the plan. They said, no, what we'll do is we'll hold the German panzers around Caen, and we'll let the Americans achieve the breakthrough through the bocage. Think about that now for a moment. And we'll look at that bocage in a minute. Now, it doesn't mean the British didn't do anything. They did attack. And on the 7th and 8th, the 3rd British Division launched limited attacks. And then on June 10th to the 15th, the British advanced the 7th Armored Division to the village here, to the south, Villers Bocage. The idea was to flank Caen, because if you could flank and cut it off, the Germans would have to retreat. So the British division faced a Panzer Reserve force of 5 Tigers and 1 Mark IV tank commanded by a Captain Whitman. They reached the outskirts of this village, and then Whitman saw these 25 tanks stop, and the soldiers got out to have a smoke, and they deployed infantry to do a scouting in advance. Big mistake. Seeing this, he sprang into action. He took his 60-ton Tiger tanks, massed them with these hedgerows, and then he went down firing broadsides at all of those parked British tanks and destroyed the whole column. Then he went into the village itself and destroyed all those troops that were stopped. He came back later in the day with reinforcements and destroyed more British. Finally, he was stopped when the British brought up their own reinforcements. But at the cost of 4 tanks, he destroyed 30 British tanks, and the British would not take that village for another 2 months. 2 months. So now both sides, there's the British advance, there's Whitman, and now for the next 42 days, there would be 6 battles to take that town. It would resemble more the trench warfare of World War I rather than the mobile war that Montgomery had stopped, had promised. The British commander, there are all the dates of all those battles. Montgomery combined very bold speech with very cautious action. Miles feared now that they were in a stalemate. And Montgomery's lack of elan, or lack of follow-through in these attacks, would be the pattern throughout the entire Normandy campaign of self-delusionment. Bradley now, now there's a rare photo. There's Bradley on the left, or I'm sorry, that's Patton on the left, Bradley and Montgomery, they're all smiling. Take a good look at that. They weren't smiling very much. Bradley now had that problem of breaking through the hedgerows, for which the Americans were not equipped or trained. There's a map of the hedgerows called the bocage, defined as a pleasantly shaded woodland. In reality, it was a dense undergrowth some 50 miles deep behind the coast. Here's an aerial view of the bocage. Thousands of small fields, 100 to 200 acres long, divided by farmers to keep their cattle hedged in instead of fences. And this, what does it look up front? I took that picture a few years ago. How'd you like to try to fight a battle in that? Now, it's interesting because both Patton and Allenbrook, the British chief of staff, knew all about this. And so had the Allied war planners. And they told Montgomery, you don't want to fight a battle in the bocage. So it's a perfect defense system. The hedgerows had a base of 3 to 6 feet. They were made of hawthorn, brambles, trees, growing up to a height of 20 feet. They really were a great combat wall, and the Americans groped their way along narrow roads. The armor was useless. If they went over the tops of the hedgerows, the Germans would fire right into their underbellies that were not armored and destroy them. Hundreds of Sherman tanks littered the area. And, of course, they had no training. They had trained in hedgerows in England, but they were not these giants. For the Germans, they used what they had learned on the Eastern Front. They called it a dirty bush war. Hitler ordered his troops to dig in, no retreat. And he took his panzer divisions and made a very big mistake, because now he blended them into the hedgerows. They were now part of the defense system. Instead of using them in an offensive way, as they had done in other operations in World War II, they now became an armored wall, so to speak, to supplement the bocage. By June the 18th, the U.S. 9th and 19th Infantry and 82nd Airborne, using more grit and finesse, had hacked and chewed their way across the Cotin Peninsula and finally got to the other side, right here, all right? But it took them all that time. At the same time, they had built this, the Mulberry Harbor. Now, what is the Mulberry Harbor? Well, it's an artificial harbor. They didn't have a harbor. You have to have a harbor to land supplies. They had Pluto, which was the underground pipeline for oil, but they built this artificial Mulberry Harbor. It was built in England. They had to bring 250 tugboats across the Atlantic from the eastern seaboard to haul it down with British boats to secure it. 2 harbors, one for the British, one for the Americans. And it worked fine until the big storm in June. And it wrecked the American Mulberry and cut down the landing of supplies. Luckily, they had learned they could beach the LSTs, and instead that's how the Americans landed the supplies. The Mulberries were slightly better in terms of how much supplies you could land off of a ship, but the beach landings made up for it because they could land more LSTs at once on the beach and would not hurt the LSTs, so it all worked out in the end. But they still didn't have a port. They did finally take Cherbourg on the 27th of June, but an Allied engineer said that the Germans had made beyond doubt the most complete, intensive, and best planned demolition job in history. Ramsay said the damage was unbelievable. The port didn't open until early September. So by the end of June, you had a stalemate in Normandy. Rundstedt and Rommel wanted to regroup behind the Seine River. He had told Hitler that he should surrender and end the war. He was replaced by Field Marshal Klug. Allied casualties began to reach levels approaching World War I trench warfare. The dead Allied soldiers were stacked up on the beaches like cordwood. And there were so many troops, supplies, and tanks stuffed into that small bridgement that they could barely move. Well, they wanted to advance and take St. Lo, an important road junction, and General Middleton and Collins' divisions were only able to creep ahead about 1,000 yards per day to St. Lo. Finally, they took it on July the 18th, and in 10 days they had suffered 10,000 casualties. So Bradley's breakout offensive, which finally occurred, had only really taken 7 miles at the cost of 40,000 casualties, which was unsustainable. Well, you may say, well, hey, where's George? Where's George? What is he doing? Well, you know, George is in the doghouse. Remember Sicily? He slapped those 2 different sets of soldiers in Sicily in an aid hospital that were suffering from battle fatigue, shell shock, whatever you called it. And he had been put in charge of the dummy army to fool the Germans. Then he made a speech about after the war, the British and Americans and maybe the Russians would rule the world. So he was in the doghouse. Well, while he was there, once the Normandy bridgehead had resulted in stalemate, he conceived of a plan. He called it Opus 1. His plan was to break out along a very narrow front. Bradley was pushing all along the line with these troops. Instead, he would break out along a very narrow corridor using armor and air tactical bombing. He told Bradley about this on June 26 and sent him a version of the plan by July 2nd. He also sent it to Eisenhower. See, one of the problems, and Patton did this to himself, he did not have a direct line to Eisenhower anymore. He had to go through Bradley. Remember, Bradley had been his deputy in Africa. There had been friction between the two of them. So now he had to go through Bradley to get to talk to Eisenhower. Well, his Opus 1 plan became Bradley's Cobra plan, which was unveiled on July 11th, very similar. Now, Patton said in his diary or his papers, he didn't care who got the credit as long as he could carry it out. So meanwhile, Bradley is very depressed. The 17th-day offensive has suffered these high casualties. The war is at a standstill. The infantry is in the hedgerows. The Sherman tanks are littered the landscape. Well, now enter Sergeant Curtis Cullen, 2nd Armored Reconnaissance. He had an idea of taking welded scrap metal parts that littered the countryside from the German defenses and soldering them onto the Sherman underbellies. And that would allow the Shermans to be anchored to the ground and burst through the hedgerows. Well, there's a Rhino tank. And July 25th, by then, 3 out of 5 tanks were Rhinos with this new ability to maneuver. This innovation alone did not cause the breakout, but it certainly helped the breakout, as you'll see. It was an important tactical advantage. Cobra, very small assault along a 6,000-yard front. The 9th Air Force fighter bombers led the attack. Then on the 25th, 1,800 B-17s and Liberators bombed of the 8th Air Force and created a corridor of death 4 miles wide and 2 miles deep, using 2,000 tons of high explosives and 2,500 tons of fragmentation bombs. Some of the bombs, of course, fell short. It killed 111 soldiers, wounded 490, and a General McNair, commander of U.S. Ground Forces, was killed. Who was the highest ranking ranking officer in northwestern Europe. Friendly fire, too often, was an occurrence during the entire Second World War. Well, how did then Cobra do it? Well, let's take a look at this very carefully. Well, now here are the tanks, there are the Rhinos. You see what they did? See the gaps? So part of it was they could now break through the hedgerows. The other part, obviously, was decimating the front with this bombing. So let's study the breakout. Let's take a look at what happened. The American Blitzkrieg aerial bombing destroyed most of the German Panzer Lehr division. All the front line tanks were obliterated. Then the U.S. 8th Corps, 3rd Armor, and Mechanized Infantry pushed up the coastal road of the Yucatan Peninsula. Remember, the armor and the infantry were married together. Armor without infantry is a dead duck. You have to have them together if they're going to be effective, so that the armor can't be attacked by the Germans throwing satchels and anti-tank weapons at them. On July 25th, they attacked. On the 27th, Catanz was captured. Klug, the field marshal, said to the Fuhrer, "The Americans are running wild." On the 28th, Arvanchet and the Potamkin Bridge was taken. The base of Normandy was reached. In 6 days, 383 panzers and 1,300 German vehicles were destroyed. Who led this? There's George. August 1st, 1944, finally the Third Army was activated by Bradley. It was high noon for George Patton. The Third Army strode upon the stage of history. They were the tip of the Allied breakthrough, the breakout out of Normandy. Let's look at the map, what they did. His 4th and 6th Armor thrust to the west into Brittany. The idea was to seize the ports. By the time they seized the ports, they were too far away from the advancing Allied armies to be of much help, and some of those ports held out to the end of the war. At the same time, they took the jumping off point for Paris and Germany. Before the Sicily slapping incident, Patton was the clear choice to be the commander of the U.S. ground forces for Overlord. Afterward, Ike realized that he needed him to lead the breakout, and Ike was right. Well, how did he do it? What did he do? Get on a tank with a sword and say, "Charge"? No, I don't think so. He was a big picture battlefield man. He discerned primary objectives miles ahead of the front. He planned these warp drives forward, capitalized on the mobility of his tanks, and he maximized the German disorder to do it. He used small-scale Michelin maps that detailed roads, rivers, and bridges. He memorized the battle area details long before the battle when he was in Britain. Here's his command car. While in England, he studied those routes. In the field, he carried 10 by 20 waterproof maps. All the features were marked with secret codes. He radioed his headquarters with these code numbers for unit action according to the map. He used leapfrog tactics. Advanced troops would surround resistance. Another advanced guard would go around it. They'd leapfrog again and again and again. He used something called his household cavalry, his intelligence sources, equipped with jeeps, armored cars, and radio sets. They ranged far and wide across the battlefront. He knew more about what was going on in France than anyone else. Another key component was this man and his tactical air force. Pete Cressada's Air Force, and the Thunderbolts, the Third Army tanks would use their VH radios. When they would come up against a roadblock, they'd call this in, and within 15 minutes, the German roadblock would be obliterated. Patton's lightning advance smashed the Germans' opposition's ability to hold any position. He glorified in this success. He wrote, "We're having one of the loveliest battles you ever saw." Well, back at headquarters, here's Hitler musing about Patton's advance. Hitler says, "Look at that crazy cowboy. He's driving down the road into Brittany along a single road." Look at this. That's that bridge right here. So Hitler said, "We will cut that road. We will launch an offensive." Oh, sorry. Let's go back. Split screen. There we are. We'll launch an offensive. There it is. They called it the Mortain Offensive. The Mortain Offensive was named after a great World War I victory. We called it, or they called it Operation Lutich. We called it the Mortain Offensive. But only 4 understrength panzer divisions were being used. Those 4 divisions in total had only 145 tanks, and they were withdrawn from the rest of the front. Remember, those tanks were being used to hold the front together. They were like Scotch tape holding that front. Now they were all withdrawn. The attack was stopped dead by the Allied air forces. It was the first time in military history that a land offensive was stopped from the air. Now, what Hitler did, though, he created the Falaise Gap. He had driven his tanks further into this pocket. And you'll notice what's happening. The British are here, and we're down there, aren't we? Thus was born this opportunity to destroy the entire German army. Total victory was turned into what I call, and David calls, the Falaise Follies. On August 8th, Patton, Ike, and Bradley all saw the potential of encircling the German 7th Army. From the north would come Monty, who had finally taken Caen, and from the south, Patton. And there you see the concept. There's Patton, there's Montgomery, and the Canadians. On the evening of August 12th, Patton had reached Argenton. He was only 6 miles from closing the gap. There was little or nothing in between him and the Canadian British forces. Then at the 11th hour, 59th minute, Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley made a hash of the whole thing. They all stopped Patton cold. The gap was not closed until August the 20th. This was one of the greatest mistakes, missed opportunities of World War II. It could have dramatically shortened the entire war. Now, that said, in many ways, the Falaise Gap was a Stalingrad in the West, because there's the German equipment, 15 divisions equipment, almost completely destroyed. However, the Allied victory was strategic, it was not strategic, because the Germans maintained the manpower capacity to finish the war. Here are the estimates that we studied of how many soldiers escaped. Our best calculation is that 200,000 Germans escaped that pocket. A German historian compared the German Falaise retreat to the successful British evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940. Eisenhower later admitted that if he had ordered the gap closed on August 12th, quote, it might have won us a complete battle of annihilation, unquote. The Allies could have ended the war in Europe in the fall of 1944 rather than May of 1945, because there was nothing between them, the German border, and into Germany. Nothing. The only limitation, admittedly, was their lousy supply situation. Here's the liberation of Paris that occurred shortly thereafter. De Gaulle marching down the Champs-Élysées. 4 days later, here comes the Americans. Why? Because de Gaulle was afraid that the communists would launch a revolt in Paris. Because remember, he was not the elected president of France. He was the head of the Free French forces, and there was a lot of opposition to him. So he asked the 28th Infantry Division and others to come into Paris, part of Patton's army. The Third Army veteran, one of them, I interviewed on his 100th birthday. He was in that parade, and he told me how ecstatic the people of Paris were. For after over 4 years, they had lived under the German yoke, and they were so enthralled and happy because they were marching to give them back their freedom. He said it was one of the most uplifting events of his life. He also told me he was ticked off because, you see, he was in the middle of this group, and the guys on the sides, the girls were kissing them and giving wine and food. He didn't get anything, and he was not happy. August 29th, Patton was now south of Paris. He had advanced 400 miles in 26 days. On the 18th, Ike had approved Patton's drive into Germany. Patton's mode of operation: I've never given a damn what the enemy was going to do or where he was. I've always gotten to the place he expected me to be 3 days before he got there. Look at where Patton is at. Look at how far ahead he is from the other Allied armies. The Third Army was 100 miles further east. On the 20th, he estimated he could breach the west wall in 10 days. On August 30th, he was closing in on Metz, 90 miles from the Rhine. The German chief of staff wrote, quote, "There are no German forces behind the Rhine. Our front is wide open." Marshall observed, quote, "Now that Patton is out of the doghouse, where he had put him, look at him go." Patton's west wall target was empty of German troops, empty. His advance into the Moselle area was then opposed by 5 undermanned German divisions. Patton wrote, "We're having a hell of a war." Here's his plan. There were 3 plans. There's their advance. There's his plan. His plan was to advance here, take Frankfurt, and go up to the Ruhr. What's the Ruhr? The Ruhr is the Pittsburgh, Gary steel mills all rolled into one at that time, and then advance on Berlin. All right? By August 29th, the German Western Front had only 100 tanks and 570 planes. The Germans on the spot termed the situation an ignominious rout and said that the Germans had run out of white flags to surrender and they were waving chickens. Well, the British objected. Monty said, he's had his turn to advance, now it's our turn. He instead said, I am prepared to do a full-blooded thrust to the north. Of course, at the same time, he'd take all the gasoline away from Patton. See, the problem was they'd run out of gas. Now, there was plenty of gas back here. Oops, sorry. There was plenty of gas back here at the beachhead. They just couldn't get it up to the front. Yes, there was the Red Ball Express, but the Red Ball Express was using up as much gas as it delivered. That wasn't going to satisfy, so they didn't have enough gas for a combined thrust by both armies. On September 2nd, Ike met with Bradley and Patton, and he stopped Patton's advance. Eisenhower's plan had been for an encirclement, as you see, by both the British and the Americans of the Ruhr, and they would both advance and take Berlin. The broad front strategy. The problem was they didn't have the gas, and lack of a port resulted in the logistics snafu. Now here's what happened. Eisenhower got the gas. Hey, for once he'd stepped on the pedal. He advanced 250 miles in 6 days. Wow! The best advance he ever did in the war, anywhere. And he took Antwerp, and thanks to the Belgium underground, he took the port, that's the port, intact. The Germans didn't think he'd get there that soon. There's only one problem. Antwerp is an inland port. It's on a river. It's called the Scheldt Estuary, and there are islands in the Scheldt Estuary. The Germans occupied the islands. Could Patton's troops have occupied the islands? Yes, they didn't. Instead, they continued their advance. So, as a result, even though they took the port on September the 4th, it was not open until the end of November. 75 more days they did not get supplies through that port. And this was a cause for a huge logistical crisis that stopped the German armies cold on the border. Now, on September the 10th, he bullied Ike into having approved Operation Market Garden, a gigantic failure, higher casualties than D-Day. And in the end, the Germans, as I said, literally had run out of gas, and the war continued. So, Was there a crisis in command? Well, Overlord was a military operation, certainly of the first magnitude. It had dazzling organization, technical ingenuity, instances certainly of great courage and bravery by soldiers of all the nations. But it included these bitter rivalries and disputes among the commanders. There's much more of that detailed in our book, and we share how it slowed that race to victory. Differing objectives of Britain and the United States added to these tensions. Churchill, as you will read in our book, was very reluctant up to D-Day to launch it because he feared failure, and instead he pressed to invade through the Balkans. Well, now let's quickly look at the commanders. Eisenhower masterfully held a difficult alliance together, and he was probably the only Allied leader that could have done it. But he also was an arbitrator, and it overshadowed his responsibilities as commander-in-chief. He failed to use his authority to rein his rebellious subordinates, particularly Montgomery, at decisive points during Overlord and during the rest of the European campaign, again and again and again. Now, Montgomery, the rogue commander, he undermined the Allied operations at Falaise and elsewhere. He overpromised what he could deliver. His egotism and lack of tact triggered great resentment among his fellow commanders. Also, he pursued Britain's political goals. And Allenbrook, who's the British Chief of Staff, and Montgomery spent more time criticizing Eisenhower's abilities and decisions rather than cooperating with him. Ramsay was an affable commander and got along well with most of his colleagues. Neptune's amphibious plan worked extremely well. His advice on logistics and the importance of opening up Antwerp were ignored until it was too late. That stalled the war and the invasion of Germany until 1945. Bradley was highly dependable, but he waited far too long to involve Patton in the Normandy breakout and erred in stopping Patton's drive to close the Falaise Gap. Patton, the maverick commander, grandstanding, lapse of judgment in Sicily, caused him to be tragically sidelined at a time he was most needed. As a result, he was not the U.S. ground commander for Overlord because he did not have that direct access to Eisenhower. Many of his important Normandy plans were thwarted. However, Patton was, without doubt, America's best offensive general in the field during World War II. Well, what final lessons can we draw from this campaign? First, victory is won by the side that makes the fewest mistakes. Well, who did better, Hitler or the Allies? Now you judge. Number two, Overlord was necessary for the Allied victory in Europe. The Russian army and Allied bombing would not have guaranteed Germany's defeat. Overlord attained most of its objectives by vanquishing the majority of German troops in Western Europe, liberating those nations, and advancing almost to Berlin. But the divisions among the Allied commanders were significant and throughout the campaign. Lesson three, we believe that the strategy of speed and mobility that was further employed before and after August of 1944 and the feudal battles of Arnhem, the Hürtgen Forest, and the Bulge would never have occurred. Unresolved crisis in command was among the factors to prolong this war in Europe for another 9 months and produce an estimated 500,000 additional casualties. Patton offered this summary. The Allies won the war the wrong way. We were too slow. Lesson four, the Allied leaders could and should have done better. 5, in 1964, Eisenhower visited Omaha Beach, and he gave us this lesson. These men came here, British and our allies and Americans, to storm these beaches for one purpose only, not to gain anything for themselves, but to fully fulfill any ambition that America had for conquest, but to preserve freedom. Many thousands of men have died for these ideals. But these young boys were cut off in their prime. I devoutly hope that we will never again see such scenes. I think and hope and pray that humanity will have learned. We must find some way to gain an eternal peace for this world. And lesson number 6 that we all need to remember, we all need to remember that freedom is not free. Thank you very much.